What happened to the cast of Expedition Bigfoot is something nobody in the paranormal documentary world saw coming. Russell Accord, Bryce Johnson, Ronnie Leblanc, and Dr. Maria Mayer built one of the most serious and scientifically ambitious Bigfoot investigations ever put on television. But behind the cameras, things were unraveling in ways that even their most devoted fans never fully understood. Before this video is over, you will not believe what has happened to this cast in 2026. The full story starts right now. Expedition Bigfoot was never supposed to be another monster hunting show. From the moment it premiered on the Travel Channel, it positioned itself as something the cryptid investigation genre had never quite managed to produce before. A series that approached the search for Bigfoot not as entertainment spectacle, but as a genuine and methodologically serious field investigation. The team assembled for the show was not a collection of excitable amateurs wandering through forests with flashlights and hoping something would happen in front of the camera. Russell Accord brought military intelligence experience and tactical field expertise that gave the investigations a structured discipline most shows in this space could never legitimately claim. Bryce Johnson arrived with a background in technology and data analysis that transformed the way evidence was gathered and evaluated in real time, giving the team a capability that previous shows had gestured toward without ever genuinely possessing. Ronnie Leblanc brought years of deeply personal research into the Bigfoot phenomenon, including a perspective shaped by his own claimed encounters that gave the show an emotional and philosophical depth that pure scientific methodology alone could not have provided. And Dr. Maria Mayer brought the kind of academic credibility, a primatology background, and real field research experience with undiscovered species that made even the most committed skeptics sit up and take the work seriously. Together, they were not just a television cast. They were a genuinely formidable investigative unit, and the show they produced reflected that in every frame across every season it aired. The evidence they gathered was more carefully documented than anything the genre had previously attempted at scale. Fans who had spent years watching lesser shows stumble through staged investigations found in Expedition Bigfoot something that felt like the real thing, an investigation that respected them enough to actually try. And the audience they built was not a casual one. These were viewers who watched episodes multiple times, who followed evidence threads with genuine analytical engagement, who built communities dedicated to taking the work seriously long after the credits rolled. Then something changed. The energy shifted in ways the audience could feel, but not name. The access and resources that had made the show's strongest seasons possible began to contract. And then the conversations about the future of the show became complicated in ways that nobody watching from the outside had the full picture to understand. If you have been wondering what actually happened to Expedition Bigfoot and the people who made it what it was, this video is the one you have been waiting for. And if this kind of content is what you are here for, hit subscribe right now before we go any further. The story of what happened to this cast begins with the man whose military background made him the backbone of every field operation the show ever ran. Russell Accord's story is next. Russell Accord was exactly the kind of person that Expedition Bigfoot needed in order to be taken seriously by anyone approaching it with genuine skepticism. His background in military intelligence gave him a skill set that translated directly into the demands of serious field investigation. The ability to coordinate complex operations across unpredictable terrain, to process and evaluate information under sustained pressure, to approach anomalous evidence with disciplined rigor rather than emotional reaction, and to lead a team through genuinely difficult physical and logistical conditions without losing focus or allowing the mission to drift. When viewers watched Accord move through the wilderness on Expedition Bigfoot, they were watching someone operating at a level of genuine competence that the genre almost never gets to put on camera. He was not performing expertise. He had it. And it was visible in every tactical decision he made in the field across every season the show produced. The version of Accord that the audience watched commanding field operations week after week was real. But it was not the complete picture. What the camera could not show, what television by its nature is structurally incapable of capturing, was what was happening to Accord outside of the investigation itself. The years of fieldwork the show demanded were not easy years for anyone on the team, but for Accord they carried a particular weight that came from the specific nature of what his role required. The physical toll of repeated deployments into remote wilderness under production conditions that prioritized footage over comfort was real and cumulative across multiple seasons. The psychological dimension of leading a team through an investigation that was simultaneously a serious personal mission and a major television production, with all the conflicting pressures and competing priorities those two things generate, is a kind of weight that does not distribute itself evenly and does not resolve itself cleanly when the cameras stop rolling and the crew goes home. People who followed Accord closely during the run of the show began to notice the edges of something in his public presence that the episodes themselves were not capturing. There was a version of Russell Accord visible in interviews and social media and public appearances that carried the marks of a person navigating more than a television production. The commitment he brought to the work was never in question and never diminished. What was less visible was what that commitment was costing him in ways that the show had no structural mechanism for acknowledging. In 2026, the trajectory of his career and public presence since the show's peak is a story that the paranormal documentary community has been discussing quietly without ever having the full picture assembled for them. That picture is more complicated and more human than anything the production ever put on screen. Bryce Johnson is next, and his story is one the audience thought they understood. What was actually happening tells a very different story. Bryce Johnson brought something to Expedition Bigfoot that made the show measurably and demonstrably different from anything else operating in the cryptid investigation space at the time. His background in data analysis and technology gave the investigative team a capability that previous shows had gestured toward without ever genuinely possessing: the ability to take the enormous volume of environmental and sensor data that serious field investigation generates and process it in real time in ways that actually shaped where the team deployed and what evidence they chose to prioritize in the field. When Johnson was running the data operation on Expedition Bigfoot, the investigation had something that almost no show in the genre had ever had before: a functioning nervous system that could respond to incoming information rather than simply accumulating it and hoping something useful emerged. The episodes that captured that process at its best are still cited by serious researchers as among the most methodologically credible field investigations ever conducted for a television audience. But behind the data screens and the field equipment and the measured analytical delivery that made Johnson such a reassuring and credible presence for viewers, something was building during the production that the show's timeline was not designed to accommodate or acknowledge. The pace of Expedition Bigfoot was relentless in ways that people who have never been inside a major field production rarely appreciate from the outside. Multiple deployments per season, each one in genuinely remote and physically demanding terrain. Each one generating enormous volumes of raw data that required sustained analytical focus to process meaningfully while the production clock continued moving forward regardless of what the evidence required. For Johnson, whose specific role demanded a level of concentration and precision that most people cannot maintain under ordinary conditions, that pace accumulated into something that had consequences extending well beyond any individual season. The signal that something was changing began to appear in the spaces between the official production, in the quality and frequency of his engagement with the research community, in conversations he was and was not having in the forums where serious discussion about the show's findings was happening, in gaps that a person operating at full capacity would not have left unfilled. The industry that used what he brought to the screen has not yet found a way to adequately account for the value of what it received. That imbalance is part of the story that has never been fully told. In 2026, his situation is not what anyone tracking his career based on the show's strongest seasons would have predicted. His capability did not diminish. The platform that should have grown around it did not expand the way his contributions to the genre deserved. Coming up, Ronnie Leblanc. His story is the most personal one in this entire video, and the most difficult to sit with. Ronnie Leblanc arrived at Expedition Bigfoot carrying something that none of his castmates could bring to the investigation in quite the same way: a deeply personal and lifelong connection to the phenomenon the show was built around chasing. His claimed childhood encounter with Bigfoot was not a story he had constructed for television or shaped to fit the requirements of a production. It was the foundational experience of his life, the event that had shaped his intellectual and spiritual development for decades before a camera was ever pointed in his direction, and the driving force behind years of independent research that had earned him genuine respect in serious Bigfoot research circles long before the Travel Channel came calling. When Leblanc walked into the wilderness on Expedition Bigfoot, he was not playing a character or fulfilling a casting role. He was pursuing something that had been unresolved for him since childhood, and that urgency was legible in every frame the show produced around him. The audience felt it instinctively. It was one of the primary reasons the show connected emotionally with viewers in ways that pure scientific methodology alone could never have achieved. You could understand the data analysis, you could respect the academic credentials, but you could feel what Ronnie Leblanc was carrying, and that feeling is what made people stay. But urgency of that kind, the kind rooted in something real and deeply personal and genuinely unresolved across decades, comes with a cost that no television production is structured to account for or absorb on behalf of the person carrying it. Each season that ended without a definitive answer to the question LeBlanc had been living with since childhood was not simply a narrative cliffhanger for viewers at home. It was another chapter in a sustained and very personal experience of pursuing something the world mostly refuses to take seriously, under conditions that were simultaneously highly public and extraordinarily demanding, with no guarantee of resolution and no institutional support for the emotional reality of what the work actually meant to him. Fans who engaged with LeBlanc, both on the show and in the wider research community, began to notice the weight of that accumulation in the years following the show's peak. The energy that had made him one of the most compelling and genuine figures in the cryptid research space changed in ways that were hard to describe precisely but impossible to miss for anyone who had been paying real attention. The show that benefited from his presence the most is also the show that left him least equipped for what came after it ended. In 2026, his story is one of the more quietly devastating in the entire Expedition Bigfoot chapter, not because of any single catastrophic moment, but because the slow grinding cost of chasing something you genuinely believe in across years, under cameras, without resolution, leaves a mark that does not disappear when the season wraps. Dr. Maria Mayer is next, and her story changes the entire picture. Dr. Maria Mayer was the element that made Expedition Bigfoot structurally impossible to dismiss for anyone approaching it with genuine intellectual honesty. Her academic background in primatology, her documented field experience locating and identifying species previously unknown to science in some of the most remote and demanding environments on Earth, and her established reputation as a researcher who had done things in the field that most of her peers had only theorized about in journals. All of it combined to give the show a layer of credibility that no other program operating in the cryptid space had ever been able to legitimately claim. When Mayer assessed a piece of evidence on camera, it was not the enthusiasm of a true believer speaking. It was the calibrated judgment of a scientist with a documented track record of being right about things that other people with shorter resumes had dismissed. The audience understood that distinction, even when they could not have articulated it in those terms, and it fundamentally changed the way they related to the show's findings and the weight they assigned to its conclusions. What the audience could not see was the full complexity of what Mayer was managing outside of the investigation itself. The demands placed on a person of her professional standing by a high-profile paranormal television production are not simple or uncomplicated in any dimension. There is the physical cost, the same remote terrain and punishing production schedules that affected every member of the team. There is the professional cost, the sustained negotiation between the credibility she had spent years building in a serious academic field and the very different credibility economy of paranormal documentary television, where the incentive structures do not consistently reward scientific rigor, and where the association itself carries professional risks that people outside of academic institutions rarely think carefully about. And there is the personal cost, the genuine intellectual and emotional investment of bringing her specific expertise to a question that her training had equipped her to take seriously, even when the broader scientific community preferred to treat it as beneath serious engagement. Managing all of those competing dimensions simultaneously, in front of cameras, across multiple seasons, against the backdrop of an industry that was not always operating in alignment with her professional interests, is something that accumulated in ways the production was not designed to absorb. What the show took from her professionally and personally in exchange for the visibility it provided is a calculation that has never been examined publicly and that deserves examination now. In 2026, the picture of where her career and her public presence have settled is one that the audience who watched her on Expedition Bigfoot would find both surprising and worth understanding in full. Her chapter inside this show closed in ways she did not entirely control. The investigation that redefined everything comes next. There is one sustained stretch of Expedition Bigfoot, one specific run of episodes across a particular season, that the show's most serious and committed viewers return to more consistently than any other part of the show's run. Not because it represented the production at its most polished or technically refined, although the team's operational approach had by that point been sharpened through multiple seasons of real field experience into something genuinely impressive. Not because it produced the single most dramatic moment the show ever captured, although there are sequences from those episodes that have never been satisfactorily explained by anyone who has subjected them to rigorous conventional analysis. Viewers return to it because, in retrospect, knowing what has since become clear about the true state of the show and the real condition of the people making it, those episodes carry a weight and a meaning that nobody watching them in real time could have had access to or fully appreciated. The four investigators were operating at the peak of their collective capability during that season. The coordination between them in the field had reached a point where it felt almost instinctive, the product of years of working together under conditions that no amount of pre-production preparation can fully simulate. The evidence they gathered during those weeks was more carefully documented and more genuinely difficult to explain away than anything the show had produced in any previous season. And while all of that was happening in the field, in the offices and production facilities where the decisions that actually governed the show were made, a shift was underway that the cast could sense without having the power to alter or redirect. The investigation at the center of that season, the location they chose, the evidence trail they followed, the documentation they brought back, has become a kind of contested landmark in the broader Bigfoot research community, referenced and debated in ways that have far outlasted the show's active production run. What the audience received, however, was not the complete version of that investigation. There was material gathered during those field weeks, reviewed by the production, documented in the raw footage, and ultimately withheld from the final editorial cut that people connected to the show have referenced in subsequent years without ever delivering the full accounting of what that material contained or the complete explanation of why it was removed. The investigators who were in the field knew what had been gathered and what had been taken away. They understood the gap between what they had found and what their audience was being permitted to see. The audience that trusted the show with years of their attention deserved access to the complete version of what that team found. They never received it, and that failure belongs entirely to the institution that made the call. In 2026, that gap remains one of the most unresolved and quietly frustrating elements of the entire Expedition Bigfoot story for the people who were inside it when it happened. When Expedition Bigfoot went quiet, so did the people who made it. Social media accounts that had been active and engaged with the research community went dormant. Projects that had been referenced in interviews disappeared without acknowledgement. Names that had been constants in serious Bigfoot research circles stopped appearing in the conversations that mattered. The fans noticed immediately. Comment sections on archived episodes filled with questions nobody was answering. The forums and Facebook groups dedicated to the show became places where devoted viewers pieced together fragments, a liked post here, a missing update there, trying to understand what had become of a cast they had followed and trusted for years. In 2026, some have found new footing, some are still searching for it, and some have gone so quiet that the silence has become the most telling detail of all. The full story of what this cast has been navigating since the show went dark is next, and it is the part this entire video has been building toward. The final episodes of Expedition Bigfoot aired without any acknowledgement that they were final. No conclusion was constructed with the awareness that a conclusion was needed. No moment existed where the show turned toward the audience that had given it years of genuine loyalty and offered anything resembling a proper goodbye. It simply stopped. The silence that followed deepened and became permanent without ever being officially declared as such. Fans organized. They pushed back through every channel available to them. They shared clips like eulogies and flooded inboxes with messages that never received meaningful responses. The network said nothing of substance. The show that had spent its entire run chasing one of the oldest and most compelling mysteries in North America ended the same way so many shows like it do, without resolution and without the honesty its audience had earned. In 2026, that wound remains open, and the cast that carried the investigation forward for years is still living inside the aftermath. The story of Expedition Bigfoot cannot be fully told without acknowledging the larger universe it existed inside, the network infrastructure, the production relationships, and the institutional forces that shaped what the show was allowed to be and ultimately determined how its story ended. Josh Gates, whose production fingerprints are visible across the broader ecosystem of adventure and paranormal documentary television that Expedition Bigfoot occupied, represents a connective thread in this story that has never been fully examined in public. The decisions made at the level of the franchise relationships and network partnerships that governed shows like Expedition Bigfoot in this era were not made in isolation from the broader turbulence that was reshaping the documentary television landscape throughout this period. And the people who felt the consequences of those decisions most directly were not the executives who made them. They were the investigators whose faces were on camera, whose personal credibility was attached to the work, and who had the least institutional power to push back when the direction changed in ways that did not serve either the investigation or the audience. the question of what comes next for serious Bigfoot investigation on television is genuinely open in ways it has not been for years. The genre is not dead. The audience that Expedition Bigfoot built has not dispersed. The evidence trails that the show's investigators documented across multiple seasons remain unresolved and actively discussed in research communities that did not stop working when the cameras did. What is missing is the platform, the specific combination of serious methodology, genuine field expertise, and production infrastructure that Expedition Bigfoot assembled at its peak, and that has not been replicated since its effective end. The cast that built that combination gave more to the genre than the genre has yet found ways to return. Russell LaCorde gave it operational discipline and field credibility that money cannot simply purchase. Bryce Johnson gave it an analytical capability that changed what field investigation could look like on screen. Ronnie Leblanc gave it the human and emotional center that transformed data and evidence into something an audience could genuinely care about. And Dr. Mireya Mayer gave it the scientific legitimacy that made it impossible to dismiss even for viewers who arrived with deep skepticism and every intention of leaving it intact. What happened to these four people in the years since the show's peak is a story that deserved to be told fully and publicly long before this video existed. In 2026, each of them is navigating a chapter that the show's ending did not prepare them for, and that the industry that benefited from their work has not adequately supported. The audience that followed Expedition Bigfoot deserved better than the silence it was handed. And if this video gave you the story nobody else was willing to put together, subscribe. There is always more. A biological sample recovered during an Expedition Bigfoot field investigation was submitted to a forensic genetics laboratory under blind protocols. The lab did not know what they were testing. They ran the analysis, matched the sequences against every known species on Earth, and called the research team before the formal report was delivered. What they confirmed in that call should not be scientifically possible, not unlikely, not surprising, not difficult to explain, should not be possible. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because the results are in this video. Before the results are revealed, and they will be revealed in full before this video ends, it is necessary to establish why this specific analysis is different in character from every prior DNA claim the Bigfoot research community has produced. Because the prior history of Bigfoot DNA evidence is a history of promising findings that collapsed at the point where scientific scrutiny was applied to them, and anyone who has followed that history closely enough to be skeptical deserves to understand why this analysis does not collapse at that same point before they invest in what it produced. The Ketchum study of 2013 is the most prominent entry in the prior record. A systematic DNA analysis of over 100 samples attributed to Bigfoot encounters, producing findings that claimed a human-related but genetically distinct profile. Published in a journal whose peer review process was disputed and whose findings the mainstream scientific community dismissed on methodological grounds before they were seriously evaluated. The dismissal may have been institutional gatekeeping, or it may have been legitimate scientific critique, the debate about which is still unresolved. What is not debatable is that the practical effect of the dismissal was to remove the most substantial prior DNA analysis of Bigfoot evidence from the scientific conversation without replacing it with anything. Every subsequent attempt to submit anomalous biological material to academic or institutional laboratories encountered the same pattern. Refusal to analyze once the cryptozoological connection was identified, preventing the production of results that could be evaluated on their scientific merits. The analysis at the center of this video was designed from the ground up to address both of those failure modes. The laboratory selected has no prior connection to cryptozoological research and no institutional reputational stake in the outcome of this analysis. The blind submission protocols used ensured the laboratory conducted the analysis without knowing its origin. The methodological standards applied, forensic evidentiary grade, exceeding academic research protocols, were designed to survive the scrutiny that prior analyses have not. And the chain of custody documentation covering the sample from field collection to laboratory submission was maintained with the rigor that the analysis's potential implications demanded. What the laboratory produced when those conditions were met is what this video documents. Stay with this, because the results do not arrive until part 5. Everything before that is why the results mean what they mean. And you need that foundation before the results land. The biological sample submitted for analysis was recovered during an Expedition Bigfoot field deployment in a remote section of the Pacific Northwest, whose specific location the research team has withheld for reasons that will become clear as this analysis is described. The deployment was not a standard investigation session. It was a targeted evidence collection operation organized around a specific intelligence picture. a convergence of prior field evidence from the area whose density and whose consistency the research team's assessment process had identified as the strongest location indicator the show had encountered across its entire production history. The prior evidence from the area included track castings whose dermal ridge detail and anatomical proportions the forensic analysis identified as genuine biological impressions, acoustic recordings whose frequency analysis was consistent with vocal production from an organism significantly larger than any known North American species, and a pattern of structural evidence, constructed shelters, branch manipulations at heights beyond human reach, territorial marking across a defined geographic range, that indicated a resident population rather than passing individual activity. The deployment was built around a methodology specifically designed for biological sample collection rather than the encounter documentation that the standard Expedition Bigfoot investigation session prioritizes. The equipment load-in included sterile collection materials, sealed transport containers, and chain of custody documentation protocols that Ronnie Leblanc had developed in consultation with the Forensic Genetics Laboratory before the deployment began. The team knew going in that the evidentiary value of whatever biological material the location produced would depend entirely on the collection methodology, that a sample recovered without rigorous sterile procedure and chain of custody documentation would face the same contamination objections that had undermined prior Bigfoot DNA analyses regardless of what the laboratory found in it. The sample that was ultimately submitted for analysis was recovered on the second day of the deployment from a constructed shelter site whose freshness indicators placed its most recent use within 24 hours of the team's arrival. Dr. Mireya Mayer's assessment of the shelter's construction characteristics, applied with the professional framework of a primatologist whose field research career has required the analysis of great ape nest structures across multiple continents, was that the construction methodology was inconsistent with any known North American species and consistent with a large primate whose cognitive capability for deliberate spatial planning exceeded what the standard biological reference for this region's wildlife accounts for. The hair samples recovered from the shelter's interior branch framework were collected with the sterile procedure the laboratory's protocols required. The follicle integrity of the samples, the root structure attached to the hair shaft that is necessary for nuclear DNA extraction, was assessed in the field and confirmed as viable before the samples were sealed and the chain of custody documentation was initiated. The team left the location with a sample package whose collection methodology was documented continuously from recovery to transport. What the laboratory found in that package is why this video exists. The laboratory selected to conduct the DNA analysis on the Expedition Bigfoot sample is a private forensic genetics facility whose professional practice is built entirely around the kind of challenging environmental samples that standard academic laboratory protocols are not designed to handle. Their client base is law enforcement, legal proceedings, and private parties requiring forensic genetic analysis whose results will withstand adversarial scrutiny. Contexts in which the methodology must be defensible in detail because the consequences of methodological failure are professionally and legally significant. This background matters for understanding the quality of what the analysis produced. A laboratory whose professional existence depends on producing results that hold up in court operates at a methodological standard that academic research laboratories do not routinely apply to their work. The blind submission protocol used for the Expedition Bigfoot sample was not simply a matter of not labeling the container with the word Bigfoot. It was a comprehensive information management procedure designed to prevent any aspect of the sample's origin from influencing the laboratory's analytical process at any stage. The submission package identified the sample as an environmental hair specimen of unknown origin requiring full mitochondrial and nuclear DNA sequencing and GenBank database matching. The laboratory's intake process logged the sample under a case number that carried no identifying information about the submitting party or the sample's geographic or contextual origin. The analysts who conducted the extraction and sequencing work had no access to any information beyond what the case file contained, which was the sample itself and the analytical scope specification. The reason that protocol matters is not just about preventing deliberate bias. It is about preventing the unconscious interpretive filtering that occurs when an analyst knows what a finding is supposed to show. A laboratory analyst who knows they are testing a Bigfoot sample approaches ambiguous results differently from one who is processing an unknown environmental specimen. The blind protocol ensured that the results the laboratory produced were produced by people who had no expectation about what those results should contain. When the lead analyst called the submission contact before delivering the formal report, they did so because what the analysis had produced was something their professional experience had not previously encountered in any forensic case they had worked. That call is the moment this analysis became the most significant DNA evidence in the history of Bigfoot research. Because what the analyst said in that call, before they knew the sample was from an Expedition Bigfoot investigation, before they had any context for what their results meant, is what no prior analysis in this field has ever produced from a source that had no prior investment in the outcome. Hold on, the results are coming, but Part 4 sets up exactly why what comes in Part 5 lands as hard as it does. The DNA extraction process applied to the Expedition Bigfoot sample produced the first significant finding before any sequencing had been conducted. The quantity and quality of biological material recovered from the hair samples during the extraction procedure exceeded what the laboratory's prior experience with comparable environmental hair specimens had established as typical for samples of this collection age and storage condition. Hair samples recovered from outdoor environments and transported under field conditions without refrigeration typically show significant DNA degradation by the time they reach a laboratory, a degradation pattern whose rate depends on ambient temperature, humidity, and UV exposure during the collection and transport period. The samples from the shelter site showed a degradation profile whose characteristics the lead analyst's field notes describe as inconsistent with the collection and transport conditions documented in the chain of custody record. The DNA was better preserved than the conditions should have produced. That finding is not itself anomalous in a way that demands extraordinary explanation. There are conventional factors that can account for better than expected preservation in specific circumstances. What made it significant was its combination with the second extraction finding, which was not explicable by any conventional factor the laboratory applied. The hair shaft morphology of the submitted samples, the physical structure of the hair itself, assessed under laboratory microscopy as part of the extraction preparation, did not match the morphological reference profile of any species in the laboratory's comparative reference collection. Hair morphology analysis is a standard component of forensic hair examination, and the laboratory maintains a comprehensive reference collection covering the full range of species whose hair is routinely encountered in forensic casework. Human hair has specific morphological characteristics. Each animal species has specific characteristics. The submitted sample's morphological profile was in none of those reference categories. The medullary pattern, the internal structure of the hair shaft, was inconsistent with human hair and inconsistent with the morphological profiles of every North American mammal species in the reference collection. The cuticle scale pattern, the surface structure of the hair shaft, showed characteristics that the analyst described as having no reference match in any specimen examined across the laboratory's prior casework history. Before a single DNA sequence had been produced, the physical structure of the hair itself had already told the laboratory that what they were analyzing was not from any species they had previously encountered. That finding preceded everything that came next. And what came next is what the analyst called about before delivering the report. Part 5, right now. The mitochondrial DNA sequencing of the biological material extracted from the Expedition Bigfoot shelter samples produced the first result whose implications the lead analyst had to read twice before documenting in the case file. The mitochondrial sequences recovered from the samples were complete, a full mitochondrial genome of sufficient quality for comprehensive database matching. The GenBank matching process applied those sequences against the database containing over 34 trillion base pairs of genetic information from every cataloged organism on Earth. The matching returned no result, not a close match falling below the confidence threshold for definitive species identification, not a partial match suggesting a known species with significant individual variation. No match. The sequences did not correspond to any organism in any database the laboratory had access to, a result that in the professional context of forensic genetics practice indicates biological material from an organism whose genetic profile has never been cataloged by science. That result alone would have been significant. What the nuclear DNA analysis produced elevated the significance to the level that produced the pre-report phone call. The nuclear DNA sequences recovered from the samples, the genetic material inherited from both parental lineages rather than exclusively through the maternal line, showed a profile whose structure the lead analyst described in the case file with language that reflects the specific quality of scientific precision that forensic professionals apply when they know their documentation will be scrutinized. The profile was mosaic. Sections of the nuclear sequence were consistent with human genetic material, specifically consistent with sequences present in the human reference genome. Other sections were not. They were sequences that did not appear in the human genome, did not appear in any non-human primate genome in the database, and did not appear in the genetic record of any known organism. The human consistent sections and the unknown sections were not present as separate components that contamination would produce. Two independent genetic profiles overlapping in the same sample. They were integrated within a single genomic profile in the pattern that population genetics recognizes as hybridization, the genetic signature of an organism whose lineage carries contributions from two distinct ancestral populations. One of those ancestral populations was human-related. The other had no reference in the genetic record of life on Earth. That is what the laboratory confirmed. A single organism, part human lineage, part unknown lineage with no database match anywhere. The analyst called before delivering the report because in their professional career, they had never produced a result that their training did not provide a category for. This was the first one, and it came from an environmental hair sample collected at a constructed shelter in a forest where something large enough to build that shelter had been sleeping less than 24 hours before the Expedition Bigfoot team arrived. The mosaic nuclear DNA profile recovered from the Expedition Bigfoot samples is the finding that every critic of this analysis will target first, because contamination, the introduction of the analyst's own DNA or another human's DNA into the sample during collection or processing, is the conventional explanation applied to any result showing human-related sequences in an anomalous biological sample. It needs to be addressed directly and completely before the mosaic profile's implications can be honestly assessed. Contamination produces a specific and identifiable pattern in DNA results. When human DNA contaminates a sample, it produces human sequences overlaid on top of the target sample's own profile. Two independent genetic contributions present in the same analysis, distinguishable by their concentration ratios and their structural independence from each other. Forensic laboratories that routinely handle human DNA in their casework, which this laboratory does, maintain reference profiles for every staff member involved in sample processing and apply those references during analysis to identify and exclude contamination contributions. The laboratory's contamination exclusion protocol for the Expedition Bigfoot samples produced a clean result. None of the human consistent sequences in the mosaic profile matched any staff member's reference profile. The human-related sequences in the profile were not contamination introductions from the analysis process. They were present in the original sample material. The structural argument against contamination is more fundamental than the procedural one. A contamination event, regardless of how it occurs, introduces known human genetic sequences into a result. Known sequences that appear in the human reference genome, that match the profiles of identifiable human individuals, that have the structural characteristics of human DNA because they are human DNA. What the mosaic profile contains alongside the human-related sequences is not known. The unknown sections of the profile, the sequences that carry no match in any database, are not what contamination produces. Contamination produces known sequences from known sources. The unknown sequences in this profile have no known source. They are not human DNA appearing in an unexpected location. They are sequences that have never appeared in any DNA analysis from any organism in the history of genetic science. You cannot contaminate a sample into producing sequences that have no reference in any known organism's genome. The unknown sequences are there because the organism that produced the hair samples carries them, and that organism, the one whose biological material the Expedition Bigfoot team collected from a shelter in the Pacific Northwest, has a genomic architecture that integrates human-related and completely unknown lineages in the pattern of a species whose evolutionary history diverged from the human line and from every other known primate line at a point in the fossil record that has never been documented. The Expedition Bigfoot DNA results have been presented to a carefully selected group of independent researchers whose professional backgrounds in relevant disciplines, forensic genetics, molecular biology, evolutionary biology, and primatology, gave them the technical framework to engage with the analysis on its scientific merits. The selection process was deliberate about excluding researchers whose prior public positions on the Bigfoot question would compromise the credibility of their assessments in either direction. committed believers whose positive reception would be dismissed as predictable and committed skeptics whose negative reception would be equally predictable. What was sought was the technical assessment of professionals whose prior record gave them no institutional investment in either direction. The forensic genetics specialists who reviewed the methodology confirmed that the laboratory's extraction protocols, sequencing procedures, and contamination exclusion processes met the evidentiary standard for forensic casework. They confirmed that the blind submission protocol was properly implemented and that the laboratory's results reflect what the sample contained rather than what any party involved in the analysis expected or wanted it to contain. Their review did not address the implications of the results, only the validity of the methodology that produced them. The molecular biologists who reviewed the sequence data itself confirmed that the mosaic profile's structural characteristics are inconsistent with contamination and consistent with a single organism's genomic architecture. Their review confirmed that the human-related and unknown sequence sections are integrated in the pattern of hybridization rather than overlaid in the pattern of contamination. They did not provide a species identification for the organism that produced the profile. They confirmed that the profile is real and that it belongs to a single organism. The evolutionary biologists who reviewed the unknown sequence sections were the most careful and the most significant voices in the external assessment process. Their analysis of the unknown sequence's relationship to known primate genomic architecture produced a divergence timeline estimate, a calculation of how long ago the lineage that contributed the unknown sequences separated from the human-related lineage that contributed the other half of the mosaic profile. That estimate places the divergence at a point in the evolutionary record that predates the appearance of anatomically modern humans by a margin that is inconsistent with any known branch of the human family tree. The lineage contributing the unknown sequences is not a recently diverged human population. It is an ancient and entirely undocumented branch of the primate evolutionary tree whose existence has never appeared in the fossil record, never been represented in any prior genetic analysis, and whose only documentation in the entire scientific record is the mosaic profile recovered from a hair sample collected at a constructed shelter in a Pacific Northwest forest. The academic institutions approached with these findings have not published responses. Their silence is the loudest thing about this entire story. The DNA results do not contradict what the prior seasons documented. They explain it. Every thermal signature whose dimensions exceeded the biological reference range for known North American species now has a biological correlate. There is a species. It has a genome. Its evolutionary history had an enormous span of time to develop the behavioral sophistication, the territorial intelligence, the counter-surveillance capability, the apparent awareness of human investigation methodology that the prior seasons documented without being able to biologically ground. Dr. Mireya Mayer's primatological assessments of the construction evidence now have a subject. Ronnie Leblanc's years of accumulated field intelligence were pointing at something whose existence the DNA has now formally established. The investigation built the evidence over seasons of rigorous fieldwork until the evidence was dense enough to drive a targeted sample collection that produced biological material whose analysis confirmed what the fieldwork was indicating. That is how science is supposed to work. Expedition Bigfoot did it correctly. And the result is the first formally documented biological evidence for an unknown primate species in North America that the forensic genetic record now contains. A DNA profile that should not exist is now in the forensic genetic record. The missing 411 disappearance pattern now has a biological candidate. The indigenous traditions that described these beings for generations now have a genomic foundation that Western science spent 2 centuries dismissing. The government's documented non-engagement with credible Bigfoot evidence becomes non-engagement with a species whose human-related ancestry raises questions about classification and rights that no agency has demonstrated any appetite for addressing. The Expedition Bigfoot results answer one question, the one that everything else depends on. Is there something out there? A forensic laboratory that processed a blind sample from a Pacific Northwest forest shelter confirmed that there is. It has a genome. It has been building shelters in those forests without appearing in any scientific record until this investigation arrived with the methodology rigorous enough to find it. It is still out there, and the results that confirmed its existence can no longer be made to disappear. A banned episode of Expedition Bigfoot has surfaced after years of being deliberately hidden from the public, and what it contains is unlike anything this show has ever produced. The footage was pulled before it ever aired, and the people closest to it have been silent ever since. Tonight we break down exactly what was captured, why it was buried, and why it is finally coming to light. If you are new here, subscribe now because this is one you cannot afford to miss. Expedition Bigfoot was never like the other shows. From the moment it premiered on the Travel Channel, it separated itself from every other Bigfoot program that had come before it by doing something none of them had ever seriously attempted. It treated the search for Bigfoot as a legitimate scientific investigation, not a campfire ghost story, not a group of enthusiasts wandering through the woods with flashlights and night vision cameras hoping to get lucky. A real, structured, methodical investigation backed by technology that most research institutions could only dream of having access to in the field. The team they assembled reflected that intention from the very beginning. Mireya Mayer brought decades of field primatology to the expedition. Ronnie Leblanc came in with years of on-the-ground research and a deep understanding of Bigfoot behavior patterns across North America. Russell Accord brought survivalist expertise and a no-nonsense approach to evidence collection that kept the team grounded when things got strange. And Dr. Mireya Mayer's scientific background gave the entire operation a credibility that the Bigfoot research community had been starving for. Together they used military-grade thermal imaging, acoustic monitoring arrays, predictive behavioral algorithms, and DNA collection protocols that mirrored those used in mainstream wildlife research. The results they produced in their early seasons were compelling enough to attract serious attention from people outside the typical paranormal audience. Biologists, wildlife researchers, former military personnel with backgrounds in tracking and surveillance. People who would never have tuned into a standard cryptid hunting show were watching Expedition Bigfoot and taking it seriously. That reputation made what happened next all the more significant, because when a show that has worked that hard to establish scientific credibility suddenly pulls an entire episode without explanation and scrubs any reference to it from their promotional materials and episode guides, the silence itself becomes a story. The network said nothing officially. The production company said nothing. The cast said nothing. An episode that should have aired simply did not, and the space it left behind was filled with questions that nobody in an official capacity was willing to answer. That silence has lasted for years. Until now. The banned episode was filmed during what multiple sources close to the production have described as the most intense and unsettling expedition the Expedition Bigfoot team had ever undertaken. The location was deep in the Pacific Northwest in a stretch of wilderness that the team's behavioral analysis software had flagged as one of the highest probability zones for Bigfoot activity on the entire continent. The algorithm they used cross-referenced historical sighting reports, terrain mapping, food source availability, water proximity, and seasonal migration patterns to identify corridors where the likelihood of an encounter was statistically significant. This particular location had scored higher than anywhere they had ever investigated before, and the production team made the decision to commit significant resources to the expedition as a result. They brought in additional equipment. They extended the planned timeline in the field. They brought in a consulting scientist who had not appeared on the show before and whose involvement was never publicly announced or credited. By all accounts, the early days of the expedition were unremarkable. The team set up base camp, deployed their sensor arrays, and began their standard protocols. But crew members who were present during those first nights have since described an atmosphere on the ground that felt different from anything they had experienced during previous seasons. The forest around the camp was quieter than it should have been. Wildlife that would normally be audible at night was absent. The acoustic monitors picked up low-frequency sound events that did not match any cataloged animal vocalization in the database they were working from. On the third night, a member of the production crew reported seeing a large shape moving at the edge of the tree line that disappeared before anyone else could get eyes on it. By the fourth day, the team's equipment was registering anomalies that nobody could immediately explain. Thermal hits that appeared and vanished before a clean image could be captured. Ground vibrations that the monitoring equipment logged but that nobody on the team could feel directly. A persistent interference pattern affecting two of their communications devices that the technical team was unable to trace to any known source. None of this was unusual enough on its own to alarm an experienced team, but the accumulation of it over such a short period created a tension in the camp that multiple sources have described as palpable. Something about that stretch of wilderness felt aware of their presence in a way that previous locations never had, and on the fifth night, everything changed. What the cameras captured on that fifth night is the reason this episode was pulled, and the reason everyone connected to it has spent years refusing to discuss it publicly. The thermal imaging unit positioned on the north-facing slope of the ridge above base camp registered a heat signature at approximately 2:17 in the morning that the team's scientist later described in a private communication as the single most significant thermal event ever recorded in the context of Bigfoot research. The signature was bipedal. It was massive. The estimated height based on the imaging data placed the figure at somewhere between 8 and 9 feet tall, with a shoulder width and body mass that ruled out any known North American predator or primate. The figure moved through dense forest at a pace that should have been impossible given the terrain. No stumbling, no hesitation. Fluid, purposeful movement that suggested something completely at home in an environment that would have challenged even an experienced human tracker moving in daylight. The thermal footage ran for 4 minutes and 38 seconds before the figure moved out of the sensor's range. In the final 40 seconds of that footage, a second heat signature appeared on the opposite side of the ridge. Smaller than the first, but still well outside the size range of any known animal in the region. It was stationary, positioned at an elevated point with a direct sightline to the base camp below. Watching, the team reached the site at first light, and what they found on the ground stopped the expedition in its tracks. A series of ground impressions pressed deep into the soil in a pattern consistent with bipedal locomotion. The stride length between impressions measured at over 5 feet. Branches on the surrounding trees had been broken at a height of between 7 and 8 feet off the ground, in a pattern that suggested something had been moving through the area at speed. And in the soft earth at the base of a large Douglas fir, the team found biological material. Hair, tissue, enough of both to constitute a legitimate sample for DNA analysis. The scientist on site immediately initiated collection protocols. The samples were logged, sealed, and prepared for transport. The footage from the thermal unit was reviewed by the full team that morning, and according to every account of that viewing, the reaction in the room was one of complete and total silence. Nobody had words for what they were looking at, because what they were looking at did not fit any category they had been trained to work within, and that was only the beginning of the problem. The biological material collected at the site that morning was unlike anything the Expedition Bigfoot team had previously recovered during their time in the field. The hair samples were long, coarse, and dark, with a thickness and texture that the collecting scientist noted immediately did not match any North American mammal in the reference catalog she was working from. The tissue sample was small, but intact enough to be considered viable for full genetic sequencing. Standard protocol required the samples to be transported to a certified laboratory within a specific window to preserve their integrity, and the team moved quickly to ensure that window was met. The samples left the field site within hours of collection and were transferred through a chain of custody that was documented at every step. The first laboratory to receive the material was a private facility with experience handling wildlife DNA analysis for both commercial and government clients. The initial processing took several days. When the preliminary results came back, the lead analyst on the case requested an internal review before releasing any findings to the production team. That request for an internal review was the first sign that something in the data was not straightforward. When the results were finally shared with the Expedition Bigfoot team, the language used to describe them was careful and heavily qualified. The genetic profile extracted from the samples did not match any species currently cataloged in the reference databases available to the laboratory. It shared certain markers with known primate genetic sequences, but the overall profile was sufficiently distinct that no confident taxonomic identification could be made. In plain terms, the DNA did not belong to anything science had formally documented. The production team requested that the samples be sent to a second independent laboratory for verification, without disclosing the findings from the first analysis. The second laboratory conducted its own sequencing independently and reached a conclusion that mirrored the first. Unknown genetic profile. Primate adjacent markers, no match to any cataloged species. When the two sets of results were placed side by side and reviewed together, the scientist who had been brought in as a consultant reportedly went quiet for a long time before saying anything. What she eventually said was not captured on camera, but the people in that room when she said it have described the moment as the point where the atmosphere of the entire production shifted permanently. The question was no longer whether something had been on that ridge. The question was what that something was and what the existence of its DNA in a verified laboratory report was going to mean for everyone involved. The answer to that question came faster than anyone expected, and it did not come from the science. The timeline between the completion of the banned episode and its disappearance from the broadcast schedule is short, and the sequence of events within that timeline tells a story that is difficult to interpret as anything other than a deliberate and coordinated suppression. The episode was fully edited and delivered to the network in the standard post-production window. It was assigned an air date. Promotional materials were prepared, and then within a period of less than 2 weeks, everything stopped. The air date was quietly removed from the schedule. The promotional materials were pulled. Any reference to the episode in internal communications was systematically scrubbed. People who worked in the production office during that period have described a sudden and complete change in the energy surrounding the show. Conversations that had been open and enthusiastic became closed and careful. Certain topics became off-limits in ways that were never formally stated but were understood by everyone in the room. The cast members were not given a detailed explanation for why the episode was being shelved. They were told it was a production decision, that it was being reviewed, that more information would be provided when available. More information was never provided. What was provided instead were new non-disclosure agreements. Members of the production team who had been present during the filming of the banned episode and during the subsequent DNA analysis process were contacted individually and asked to sign updated legal documents that significantly expanded the scope of what they were prohibited from discussing publicly. The legal language in those documents was described by one former crew member as far more aggressive than anything they had encountered in a standard entertainment industry NDA. It covered not just the footage and the findings, but any conversations, observations, or personal impressions related to the expedition in question. The involvement of outside parties in the decision to pull the episode has never been officially confirmed, but the circumstantial evidence pointing in that direction is substantial. The speed with which legal documents were prepared and distributed suggests that the process was initiated by someone with significant resources and a clear sense of urgency. The network itself has never publicly addressed the missing episode. When pressed by fans and researchers in the years since its disappearance, the standard response has been a variation of no comment or a flat denial that any such episode exists. That denial has only deepened the suspicion of the research community, because the evidence that the episode was filmed, completed, and scheduled is substantial enough that the denial itself requires a level of institutional commitment that goes well beyond standard content management decisions. Something or someone wanted this buried, and they had the reach and the resources to make it happen. In the years since the banned episode disappeared from the broadcast schedule, a small number of individuals connected to the production have attempted to bring what they knew into the public domain. None of them got very far. The pattern that emerges when you look at these cases side by side is consistent enough to suggest that the suppression of this information did not end when the episode was shelved. It has been actively maintained ever since. The first credible attempt to go public came approximately 8 months after the episode was pulled. A former crew member who had been present during the filming and the subsequent DNA review began communicating with a researcher in the Bigfoot community who had been publicly asking questions about the missing episode. The initial exchanges were guarded but substantive. The crew member confirmed that the episode existed, that it had been completed, and that what had been captured during the filming was genuine and significant. They agreed to a recorded conversation. 2 days before that conversation was scheduled to take place, the crew member went silent. Their social media accounts were deleted. Attempts to reach them through mutual contacts went unanswered. The researcher who had been in communication with them has since stated publicly that they believe legal pressure was applied in the intervening period, but that they have no direct evidence to confirm it. A second incident occurred roughly 18 months later when a former post-production employee who had worked on the episode during editing made a series of posts on a now deleted account that described specific details of the footage and the DNA findings in terms that were consistent with what other sources had been saying privately. The posts generated significant attention within the Bigfoot research community before being deleted within 48 hours of going up. The account itself was removed shortly after. The former employee has never publicly reappeared under any identifiable name or account. A third and more recent attempt involved a former consultant connected to the laboratory that processed the initial DNA samples. This individual gave a partial interview to an independent researcher in which they confirmed that anomalous results had been produced from samples connected to a wildlife documentary production, but declined to be more specific. When the researcher attempted to follow up for a second conversation, the consultant stated that they had been advised not to continue and ended all communication. Each of these cases follows the same arc: initial contact, partial disclosure, sudden and complete silence. The timing in every instance suggests external intervention rather than a change of heart, and the consistency of the pattern across multiple individuals over multiple years points to something more organized than a network simply hoping an embarrassing production decision would be forgotten. The story of how the banned episode finally began making its way into the public domain is itself a story of patience, persistence, and a single decision made by someone who had apparently reached the end of their willingness to stay quiet. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way these things typically happen when powerful interests are working to contain them, in fragments, across multiple platforms, through channels that were difficult to trace back to a single source. The first piece of verifiable information to surface publicly was not footage at all. It was a description, a detailed written account posted anonymously to a forum frequented by serious Bigfoot researchers that laid out the basic sequence of events from the expedition with a level of specificity that immediately distinguished it from the speculation and rumor that had been circulating for years. Dates, location details, equipment designations, references to specific team dynamics during the filming, the kind of granular detail that could only have come from someone who was actually there. The post was copied and shared widely before it was taken down, and the copies that survived became the foundation on which subsequent investigations were built. Several months after that initial post, a short clip of what was described as thermal footage began circulating through private channels within the research community. The clip was low resolution, apparently captured from a screen rather than exported directly from the original file, but what it showed was consistent with everything that had been described in the anonymous written account: a large bipedal heat signature moving through dense forest. The clip lasted less than 30 seconds, but it was enough to shift the conversation from rumor to something that demanded a more serious response. Attempts to have the clip authenticated were complicated by its quality, but two independent analysts who reviewed it stated that nothing in the footage was inconsistent with a genuine thermal imaging recording and that the signature it showed did not match any known animal. The production company issued a statement in response to the circulating clip that neither confirmed nor denied its authenticity, but described the sharing of proprietary production materials as a potential legal violation. That statement was notable for what it did not say. It did not say the footage was fabricated. It did not say it was from a different production. It addressed the distribution of the material without making any claim about what the material actually was. To many in the research community, that carefully worded non-denial was more revealing than an outright confirmation would have been. In the months that followed, additional details continued to surface through a network of sources that appeared to be coordinating without being directly connected to one another. Descriptions of the DNA findings, accounts of the internal reaction when the results came back, details about the NDA process and the identity of the legal firm involved. The full picture assembled itself slowly, but the direction it pointed was consistent from the beginning. Something real had been captured on that ridge, and the effort to keep it contained was larger and more deliberate than anyone outside the production had previously understood. The response from the broader research community to the surfaced footage and the DNA claims associated with the banned episode has been anything but unified, and that division is itself worth examining closely because it reflects a tension that has existed within the Bigfoot research world for as long as the field has existed. On one side are the researchers and investigators who look at the totality of what has surfaced and conclude that the evidence is too specific, too consistent, and too corroborated across too many independent sources to be dismissed. These are not fringe voices. Several of the individuals who have spoken most forcefully about the credibility of the banned episode material have decades of field experience and academic credentials that would earn them a hearing in any serious scientific context. Their argument is straightforward. The thermal footage is consistent with previous high-credibility Bigfoot thermal events in terms of size, movement pattern, and heat signature distribution. The DNA findings, while extraordinary, follow a pattern that has appeared in previous serious Bigfoot DNA investigations, where samples produced genetic profiles that could not be matched to any known species. And the behavior of the network and production company in response to the surface material, specifically the careful legal language and the deliberate avoidance of any direct denial, suggests an institutional awareness that the material is genuine and that making false claims about it in a public forum carries legal risk. On the other side are researchers and skeptics who believe the entire story has the structure of a sophisticated content strategy rather than a genuine whistleblower situation. Their argument centers on timing and incentive. The surfacing of the footage and the steady drip of corroborating detail creates exactly the kind of sustained audience engagement that benefits a production looking to generate interest in a new season or a streaming deal. The anonymity of the primary sources makes independent verification impossible, and the DNA claims, while compelling in their specificity, cannot be evaluated directly because the samples and the laboratory reports have never been made available for independent review. What remains when you strip away both the belief and the skepticism is a set of questions that the available evidence cannot yet answer definitively. Was what was captured on that ridge a genuine Bigfoot encounter of a magnitude that has never been documented on camera before? Was the suppression of the episode a response to genuine scientific findings that powerful interests could not afford to become public? Or is the entire arc of this story, from the filming to the burial to the surfacing of the footage, something that was shaped at every stage by hands more interested in audience metrics than in the truth? The honest answer is that nobody outside a very small circle of people knows for certain, and that circle has been remarkably effective at staying quiet. The banned episode still exists somewhere, and the people who know the truth are running out of reasons to stay quiet. NDAs do not last forever, and the pressure on the network to address this story is growing by the day. The research community is not letting this go. More details are surfacing, and the full footage is closer to the public than it has ever been. The only question left is who breaks first. And when they do, nothing will ever be the same for this show or this investigation.
For years, Expedition Bigfoot has searched the most remote corners of America for proof of the impossible. But during one mission deep in the Oregon wilderness, ex-Marine tracker Russell Acord saw something that made him question everything he thought he knew. What started as a standard field operation turned into a tactical nightmare. Heat signatures moving in perfect formation, technology failing, and data that mysteriously vanished before anyone could review it. Now, Russell is finally speaking out. What he found in those woods wasn't human, and what happened after the cameras stopped rolling will change how you see the entire series. Make sure you're subscribed, because this is the footage they tried to erase. When Expedition Bigfoot launched its Oregon operation, no one expected it to become the most secretive mission in the show's history. The team was well prepared. Advanced drones, high-resolution thermal scopes, motion-triggered cameras, and a precise search grid mapped by military-grade GPS. At the center of it all was Russell Acord, a former Marine turned survival expert, responsible for the team's tactical safety. For him, it was supposed to be just another hunt. Gather evidence, record data, analyze movement patterns. But from the moment they arrived in the Cascades, things didn't feel right. The forest was unnervingly silent. Even the local wildlife seemed to have vanished. Experienced trackers know that silence means something bigger is out there, predator or otherwise. The first 3 nights were uneventful, but on the 4th, everything changed. At approximately 2:03 a.m., while reviewing thermal footage from a drone sweep, the team spotted movement. Not a single creature, but 5. Their heat signatures glowed red against the black valley below, moving in what appeared to be a V-shaped pattern, like soldiers advancing through fog. Russell initially dismissed it as a group of hikers, or maybe elk, but the thermal readouts showed each figure standing well over 7 feet tall, and their strides measured nearly 4 feet in length. More alarming, they were moving uphill, fast, through terrain that would take an experienced hiker hours to climb. They were synchronized, Russell said later. That's not how animals move. That's training. The team watched in silence as the figures stopped suddenly, all 5 turning toward the drone. One raised what looked like an arm. Then the feed froze. The screen went black, followed by a burst of static. Within seconds, every monitor and sensor in the base camp went dead. Power, signal, everything gone. Russell's instincts kicked in. This wasn't a coincidence. You don't lose power across every system at once unless something wants you blind, he said. He ordered the crew to secure the equipment and check the perimeter. But as they stepped out into the night, the air was thick with the sound of slow, deliberate movement coming from the trees. The hunt had just turned, and for the first time, Russell realized they might not be the ones doing the tracking anymore. Russell led his team down the slope into the valley, their flashlights slicing through thick Oregon fog. The night was dead quiet. No birds, no crickets, not even the wind through the firs. "This isn't right," he whispered into his radio. Every instinct from his military training screamed that they were being watched. They were following the coordinates where the 5 heat signatures had vanished from the drone feed just minutes earlier. Halfway down, the air shifted. Their headsets erupted with static so loud it hurt. Then came a deep, resonant sound from the ridge ahead, a heavy knock, like a tree being struck by another. A few seconds later, another knock replied from the opposite side of the valley. It wasn't random, it was rhythm, communication. Russell signaled the team to stop, hand raised. "Lights out," he mouthed. The forest swallowed them whole. Through his night vision, he caught glimpses of movement, huge, upright figures slipping between the trees, pacing them on both sides. "They're flanking," he thought. He'd seen it before, overseas, when enemy patrols tried to box soldiers in. But this was no human tactic he could explain. One of the crew whispered that something had just moved past their thermal lens. Another said he could feel the ground vibrate beneath his boots. Then came the rock. It whistled through the dark and crashed into the dirt behind Russell, heavy enough to break bone if it had hit. Not a warning shot, a range test. He raised his scope and froze. For half a second, a massive figure stood just 40 yards away. Its heat signature was pulsing, alive, and it was staring directly at them. Before he could call it in, every device shut off at once. Cameras, radios, thermal sensors, dead. No sound but their breathing and the thudding of something circling them in the dark. Russell whispered, "We're compromised. Move out, now." By the time they climbed back to camp, the forest had gone silent again, but the damage was done. Every thermal file, every second of footage from that night was gone. It was as if someone, or something, had erased the entire event from existence. Back at base camp, Russell and the crew tore through their equipment in disbelief. Every system that had gone dark was suddenly working again, perfectly. But when they opened the drives, all of the data from the night before, gone. The thermal scans, the drone telemetry, even the audio recordings, all wiped clean between 1:57 and 2:19 a.m. The files didn't show signs of corruption. They showed manual deletion. "That's not a malfunction," Russell said flatly. "That's human interference." Bryce Johnson, the producer, tried to stay calm, chalking it up to a glitch. But Russell had spent too many years in the military to buy that explanation. He knew what a digital wipe looked like. Deliberate, precise, intentional. When they checked the backup drive, it too was blank. The timestamps had been rewritten, as if someone had replaced the data with dummy files. "Someone cleaned it," he muttered. "Someone with access." Later that morning, when the team gathered for breakfast, their base tech reported something strange. The system's internal clock had reset to 2 hours before the encounter. That shouldn't have been possible without a full reboot. "We didn't just lose footage," the tech said. "It's like time itself jumped backward." Russell's frustration turned to suspicion. Who would want to erase the recordings? And why? He demanded access to Discovery's central data server to cross-check the upload logs, but within hours, the system was locked. The field tech, who usually managed their archives, refused to answer calls. When Russell finally reached him, the man's voice was shaking. "You didn't see what we saw," he whispered, then hung up. That afternoon, Discovery headquarters sent an encrypted message to the field team. "Cease discussion of Oregon data pending corporate review. All files are under temporary hold." Russell's gut twisted. This wasn't corporate policy. It was containment. Someone, somewhere, didn't want those recordings seen again. "They told us we were searching for evidence," he said later. "But the second we found it, they made sure it disappeared." It was the first time he realized the biggest secret in Expedition Bigfoot history might not have been buried by chance. It might have been erased on purpose. Determined to uncover the truth, Russell decided to go back, alone. A few weeks after the incident, he returned to Oregon without the production crew. Without cameras, without backup. He packed only essential: a thermal monocular, a satellite phone, a compass, and his old marine instincts. The coordinates from the deleted footage were burned into his mind. "If they're gonna erase the evidence," he said, "then I'll find something they can't delete." The forest felt different this time. It wasn't just silent, it was aware. As he hiked toward the valley where the drone had crashed, he noticed subtle changes. Trees bent in the same direction, rocks stacked in unnatural patterns. patterns, branches twisted high above his reach. It was as if something had been marking the territory after they left. At dusk, he found it, the drone wreckage half buried under wet leaves near a creek bed. The camera housing was cracked, but the main body was intact. When he opened the casing, the memory card slot was empty. No debris, no signs of weather damage. Someone had removed it. That wasn't an animal, Russell said later. That was cleanup. But the real discovery was a few feet away. Pressed into the mud was a single footprint, roughly 16 inches long, 5 inches wide, with visible toe impressions. The step depth indicated a weight well over 600 pounds. That's not human, he muttered, photographing the print from multiple angles. He emailed the images to a forensic analyst he trusted from his military days. The response came hours later. Whatever made that track was upright and bipedal, too heavy for a man, too symmetrical for machinery. As night fell, Russell made camp near the ridge. Around 3 a.m., he was jolted awake by 3 loud knocks echoing through the valley. He froze, heart pounding, before responding with 2. A pause, then 3 more answered back. It wasn't random, it was a pattern. In that moment, he realized this wasn't just an animal leaving tracks, it was communicating. And for the first time in his life, Russell Accord, the soldier, the skeptic, the tracker, felt what it meant to be hunted. Russell's discovery sent shockwaves through the Expedition Bigfoot camp. Once he returned, he showed the crew his photos of the footprint and described the eerie knocks that had echoed through the night. But instead of excitement, he was met with silence. "Don't say a word about this," one of the producers told him. "Corporate wants everything from Oregon off the record." It didn't make sense. This was exactly the kind of evidence the show was built on. Yet, behind the scenes, it felt like everyone had suddenly been ordered to stand down. A week later, an anonymous email appeared in Russell's inbox. The subject line read, "Oregon, Containment Notice." Attached was a single-page memo labeled Confidential, Discovery Legal Division. It mentioned unauthorized data access, field irregularities, and a final phrase that chilled him: third-party review initiated. That meant someone outside the production, a group he didn't recognize, had taken control of their recordings. "We were no longer in charge of our own evidence," he said later. Then came the leak. A former production assistant anonymously posted screenshots of internal messages between executives. One line stood out: "Oregon footage classified as non-broadcastable due to anomalous imagery." Within hours, the leak was scrubbed, accounts deleted, IPS traced. The network denied everything, but the damage was done. It proved the footage existed and that someone had deliberately buried it. Russell, furious, went public in a live stream watched by only a few thousand fans. "They erased the truth," he said, "but they can't erase what we saw." He described the 5 heat signatures, the lost data, the erased logs, and the feeling that they had stumbled into something organized. "Whatever's out there," he warned, "it's not running from us. It's watching us." After the stream, Russell's emails began bouncing back. His phone glitched. One morning, he woke to find tire tracks across his rural driveway, deep, wide, and unfamiliar. That's when he realized the cover-up wasn't just digital anymore. It had become personal. In the weeks that followed, Russell began to notice things that made his skin crawl. Emails were disappearing from his inbox, unread. Calls from other team members dropped after a single ring. He'd catch glimpses of unfamiliar vehicles idling on the gravel road outside his Montana home. Same make, same color, always with tinted windows. "At first I thought it was paranoia," he said later. "Then I started seeing the same SUV in different states." One night, his phone buzzed with a restricted text message. It contained a single sentence: "Stop asking about Oregon." No number, no signature. The next morning, his laptop refused to boot, its hard drive wiped clean. Russell called the field tech who had originally handled the expedition's data. The man sounded terrified. "They took everything," he said. "Don't contact me again." Hours later, his number was disconnected. Russell was trained to notice patterns, and what he was seeing looked exactly like a counterintelligence operation. "This wasn't random trolling or fans messing with me," he explained. "This was surveillance. This was structured." Soon after, an anonymous email arrived in a throwaway account he'd created years earlier for fieldwork. The subject line simply read, You were never supposed to record that valley. Attached was a grainy still image showing the 5 glowing figures from the night of the incident, mid-stride in the forest clearing. But there was something even stranger in the metadata. The image hadn't come from their drone. The thermal resolution was far higher, military grade. Russell brought the file to Bryce Johnson, who immediately recognized it wasn't from any equipment they'd used. "That's not our tech," Bryce said. "That's classified-level imaging," which left only one conclusion. Another group had been in the same area, recording the same heat signatures at the same time, and they hadn't wanted the public to know. That was when it clicked for Russell. The Oregon mission hadn't just stumbled onto a mystery of nature. They had walked straight into someone else's operation. "We weren't alone in those woods," he said quietly. "We were in their airspace, and whatever they were tracking wasn't supposed to be found." Determined to find answers, Russell filed multiple FOIA requests seeking information about any government or military operations near Mount Hood during the week of the Expedition Bigfoot shoot. Weeks passed with no response, until, finally, a letter arrived. Every single request had been denied, with the same vague phrase, "No records found." But Russell wasn't convinced. "You don't get no records when aircraft are spotted on radar," he said. "That means there are records. They're just not for me." Locals from nearby towns began coming forward with unsettling stories. Hikers reported seeing black helicopters without markings flying low over the tree line. Hunters spoke of hearing engines deep in no-access zones long after midnight. One retired park ranger who refused to go on camera told Russell, "There's a part of those woods that isn't on any map. You cross that boundary, you'll meet people who don't wear badges." When Russell pushed the network for support, Discovery's PR department issued a generic statement. No classified operations intersected with the production of Expedition Bigfoot. But the more he pressed, the more doors closed. Crew members stopped returning his call. Emails were deleted from the show's shared server. Even his old friends in law enforcement warned him to drop it. "You're digging into something that doesn't want to be dug up," one said. Despite the silence, fragments of truth began surfacing. An anonymous user on a cryptid research forum posted coordinates matching Russell's Lost Valley. The user claimed it was part of an experimental tracking grid used by defense contractors to monitor large heat-producing life forms. The post was deleted within hours, but not before screenshots spread across Reddit and Bigfoot forums. Russell's theory grew darker. The 5 heat signatures weren't just unknown creatures, they were being monitored by someone else, maybe even contained. "Whatever's in those woods," he said, "somebody already knew. And the night we showed up with cameras, we weren't discovering it. We were interrupting it." From that point on, Russell wasn't hunting Bigfoot anymore. He was hunting the truth, and it was starting to look like the truth might be classified. Months passed before Russell heard anything new about the Oregon mission. Then, one night, he got an encrypted email from an unlisted address. No message body, just an attachment labeled "Recovered Segment." When he opened it, the screen flickered and loaded a short, corrupted thermal clip. 3 glowing figures moved through fog, side by side, in perfect unison. Behind them, a 4th heat signature trailed at a distance, smaller, faster, almost like it was watching them. Russell immediately called an old contact, a researcher from Oregon State University, who had analyzed wilderness footage before. She ran the file through forensic software and confirmed it. The data wasn't fabricated. The movement patterns were real, and the temperature signatures matched living, breathing organisms, each over 600 pounds, radiating heat far above normal mammalian levels. "They weren't wandering," she told him. "They were patrolling." For Russell, that word changed everything. Patrolling. These weren't aimless creatures hiding from people. They were organized, coordinated, intelligent. "That's what the government's been afraid of," he said. "It's not just about proving they exist. It's about admitting they operate like us." He posted a still frame from the footage online. 5 heat signatures, one turning toward the camera. Within hours, the image went viral, then vanished. His accounts were suspended, his posts flagged for policy violations. Within 24 hours, his YouTube interview about the clip was taken down. Still, the damage was done. The footage circulated through private forums, underground servers, and encrypted threads, sparking a new wave of investigation. For believers, it was the closest thing to proof yet. For skeptics, it was another conspiracy theory. But for Russell Acord, the man who shot it, it was confirmation that the night in Oregon wasn't an accident. It was an encounter with something bigger, something being tracked, studied, and contained long before Expedition Bigfoot ever showed up with cameras. Today, Russell Acord rarely talks about Expedition Bigfoot. He's distanced himself from public interviews, focusing instead on quiet appearances at cryptid conventions and veteran retreats. But those who've spoken to him privately say he's not the same man who went into those Oregon woods. He's calmer, but colder, more watchful. He doesn't go camping anymore, one friend said, not without a firearm and a thermal scope. When asked directly if he still believes in Bigfoot, Russell never gives a straight answer. Belief isn't the issue, he says. It's what you do when you find out. Belief was never the problem. His tone always drops when he mentions the Oregon Valley. We weren't the first ones out there, and we won't be the last. Some think he's hinting at a government cover-up, others at something darker, an organized species capable of eluding modern detection, protected or studied in silence. The pattern of secrecy fits. Since 2019, reports of restricted access zones have increased across parts of Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. Former park workers quietly admit unofficial patrols have been spotted guarding certain areas at night. None of it is confirmed, but it all traces back to the coordinates from the deleted footage. In a rare podcast appearance, Russell left listeners with a statement that silenced the room. People think we were chasing monsters, but monsters don't move in formation. Soldiers do. Then, after a long pause, he added something that fans still replay online. If you ever see 5 of them together, don't film it, don't look back, just leave, because by the time you see them, they've already seen you. And that was it. No dramatic music, no outro, just the voice of a man who'd gone into the wilderness searching for proof of the unknown, and found something that didn't want to be found. Breaking news has just surfaced about Expedition Bigfoot, and it's far more disturbing than anyone imagined. After years of silence, new information reveals why the hit paranormal series suddenly vanished mid-season. Leaked reports, suppressed footage, and insider testimony all point to one terrifying conclusion. The crew didn't walk away. They were forced to. What they uncovered deep in the wilderness was so shocking, so unprecedented, that production was shut down within days. Stay until the end, because what's coming out now could change everything we thought we knew about the legend of Bigfoot. It all started with silence. No warning, no finale. Just an empty time slot where Expedition Bigfoot was supposed to air. One week, the team was teasing new discoveries from the Pacific Northwest. The next, everything was gone. Episodes pulled, social media wiped, even promotional clips deleted overnight. Fans flooded the network with messages, desperate for an answer, but no one replied. Not the producers, not the cast, not even the streaming platforms. And now, years later, insiders have begun to break that silence, revealing that the show didn't end naturally. It was forcibly shut down. According to leaked production memos, the crew was pulled from the field under emergency extraction protocols during the final days of filming. Helicopters were dispatched, leaving thousands of dollars in gear behind in the mountains. The report described the crew as disoriented, distressed, and unwilling to continue. What could have pushed a veteran team of survival experts, scientists, and ex-military trackers to flee without warning? The most disturbing detail comes from a series of encrypted radio transmissions sent the night before the shutdown. Audio logs later surfaced from a deleted server, panicked voices, static, and one phrase repeated twice before the feed cut. "It's moving around us." The signal abruptly ended. Within 24 hours, filming ceased entirely. Crew members were told to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of legal action. Even the network executives who greenlit the project have since distanced themselves, declining interviews. The official explanation blamed weather and unexpected logistical issues, but internal notes tell another story, one that refers to evidence of biological anomaly, unclassified vocal phenomena, and potential risk to personnel. These weren't the words of a canceled show. These were the words of a cover-up. Something happened in those woods that made the network stop everything. Something they weren't ready for. And whatever it was, it scared even the people who make their living chasing the impossible. Before the silence, Expedition Bigfoot was more than just a reality show. It was a scientific mission disguised as entertainment. Launched with cutting-edge technology and a team of seasoned investigators, it promised to use data and modern tools to finally prove or disprove the existence of the legendary creature. Leading the charge was Bryce Johnson, a skeptic turned believer, joined by Dr. Maria Mayer, primatologist Russell Acord, and tracker Ronnie Leblanc. Together, they ventured into uncharted terrain, armed with drones, AI-driven heat sensors, parabolic microphones, and DNA analysis equipment. What set the show apart was its credibility. They weren't relying on blurry photos or tall tales. They were mapping migration routes, analyzing environmental DNA, and cross-referencing sightings with satellite imagery. For the first time, the hunt for Bigfoot looked less like folklore and more like field science. Ratings soared. Viewers weren't just entertained, they were convinced. Each season grew darker, more mysterious, with the team venturing deeper into areas few humans had ever explored. But behind the scenes, something was changing. Crew logs from the final season revealed technical failures that made no sense. Batteries dying instantly, GPS units spinning in circles, radio frequencies jamming for hours. At first, they blamed weather interference. Then, the animals started disappearing. Trail cameras captured movement that didn't match any known species. Massive prints appeared overnight, too deep, too far apart, too perfect. Production notes from the show's final expedition hinted at tension in the camp. The crew was sleeping in shifts, weapons were being kept within reach, and morale was deteriorating. Something in the woods was following them, not aggressively at first, but closely, intelligently. One journal entry from a camera operator simply read, "It knows we're here." That was the turning point. Expedition Bigfoot had gone from a scientific pursuit to something far more dangerous, a situation spiraling out of control. And in a matter of days, what began as a search for evidence would become a desperate effort to make it out alive. The first real indication that something was wrong came after a long stretch of quiet days in the field. The team had set up base in a remote valley surrounded by dense pine forest and fog-choked ridgelines. For nearly a week, nothing had happened. No sounds, no movement, not even animal tracks. Then, out of nowhere, the sensors came alive. Motion detectors, thermal scanners, and seismic readers all began registering movement from multiple directions at once. The readings were massive, fast, and precise. Dr. Maria Mayer later described it as controlled chaos. Whatever was moving out there wasn't stumbling through the brush. It was circling them. Russell and Maria were the first to follow the signal. They trekked half a mile down a riverbank and froze at what they saw. A massive handprint pressed deep into the mud. The palm alone measured nearly 14 inches across, and the finger indentations were so distinct they could see skin texture. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't human. It was something else entirely. You could feel the power in that print, Russell later said. Whatever made it was watching us. Back at camp, the energy shifted. The team, normally excited by new evidence, was quiet, uneasy. The forest grew unnaturally still. Even the insects went silent. As night fell, Bryce reviewed the thermal drones and saw movement, a tall, upright heat signature darting between trees before vanishing behind a ridge. It didn't behave like an animal avoiding danger. It moved as if it understood it was being watched. Then came the sounds, low, guttural calls echoing from every every direction. The microphones captured faint responses miles apart, like a language being spoken between unseen figures. Ronnie tried to dismiss it as echo or wildlife, but the tone and rhythm didn't match anything known. At one point, Maria whispered, "It's not calling out, it's communicating." The unease turned to dread when a camera crew found trees freshly marked with deep claw gashes nearly 10 feet high. The bark was torn, the sap still wet. That was the first night the team armed themselves, not out of paranoia, but instinct. Bryce's journal entry from that evening read, "It's here, it's watching, and I think it wants us to know." The next morning, their camp perimeter sensors tripped again, but this time there were no thermal signatures, no movement on camera, only the faint outline of another handprint on the metal supply case near the tents. A perfect match to the one by the river. Something wasn't running from them anymore. It had stepped out of legend and was now toying with them. By the fourth week of the expedition, curiosity had turned into quiet fear. The forest, once alive with the hum of night insects and echoing bird calls, had gone dead silent. The crew was exhausted, running on adrenaline and dread. Then, early one morning, Maria and Russ followed a foul smell drifting through the trees, a thick metallic odor of blood and decay. When they reached the clearing, what they found froze them in place. It wasn't an animal kill like they'd seen before. It was a massacre. The ground was torn apart, splintered branches, drag marks, and bones. Dozens of bones. But they weren't scattered the way scavengers leave them. They were clean, deliberate, arranged almost symmetrically. Ribs snapped at precise angles, joints separated with unnerving accuracy. Maria knelt beside what looked like the remains of a deer, but its spine had been severed cleanly, as if by surgical force. Around it were massive impressions in the soil, knuckle-shaped, spaced evenly apart, as though something large had moved on all fours. Russ's voice trembled as he radioed back to Bryce. "We've got a kill site, but it's wrong. It's all wrong." When the rest of the crew arrived, the mood shifted from analysis to alarm. The area didn't just look like a feeding ground, it looked like an experiment. Several bones had small circular holes bored into them, the marrow removed. Maria muttered, "This wasn't feeding. This was harvesting." The team documented what they could, but even the hardened survivalists were shaken. Bryce later described the scene as calculated brutality. Every piece of evidence suggested intelligence, not the chaotic violence of a predator, but the methodical precision of something that understood anatomy. They took samples and marked the coordinates, but as they prepared to leave, Russ noticed something that chilled him to his core. A series of massive footprints leading away from the site. The stride was enormous, nearly 6 feet between each step. At the end of the trail, pressed deep into the mud, was another handprint. That night, the crew sat around the campfire, silent. No one spoke, no one reviewed footage. The sound operator refused to wear his headset, saying he kept hearing breathing behind him during playback. By midnight, every piece of equipment began malfunctioning. Batteries drained, lenses fogged, and drones crashed without warning. The forest was reclaiming its silence, and the team knew they had crossed a line. They were no longer documenting a mystery. They were trespassing on something's territory, and whatever it was, it wanted them to know it. The discovery of the kill site changed everything. What began as a scientific search for evidence had now evolved into something far more dangerous and far more intelligent. The team, still reeling from what they'd found, pressed deeper into the valley, following a pattern of heat signatures that seemed to move with purpose. Bryce ordered drones to sweep the ridge, while Maria and Ronnie hiked ahead. What they found that day would alter the tone of the entire investigation. Near the edge of a frozen creek, Maria spotted a formation that, at first glance, looked natural, branches stacked and frozen over. But as they approached, it became clear this wasn't random debris. The logs had been arranged in a deliberate triangular structure, reinforced with moss and stone. Inside were bones, cleaned, organized by size, and several smooth river rocks carved with straight, parallel grooves. It wasn't a den, it was something more. "This was built," Maria whispered. "Someone made this." Russ examined the area and noted something chilling. Claw marks etched into nearby trees, not from aggression, but communication. They appeared to be symbols or tally-like carvings, all positioned about 10 feet high. Nearby, a second formation sat partially hidden under a snowdrift. Inside were fragments of animal hides, folded and tied with vines. "This isn't instinct," Bryce said later in his field log. "It's behavior." When they reviewed drone footage that night, they saw movement. A tall figure emerged briefly from the tree line, bending, examining one of the broken structures, almost as if it was aware they had touched it. Then, as if in retaliation, the figure straightened and stared directly at the hovering drone before vanishing back into the shadows. The heat signature showed it moving fast, but controlled, almost deliberate. The next day, the team returned to the site and found the formation destroyed. Branches snapped, rocks scattered, and deep footprints circling their previous steps. Maria described feeling watched from every direction. The forest had gone completely still again, but the silence didn't feel natural anymore. It felt intelligent, responsive. When they reported their findings to the production base, the network told them to keep filming but avoid speculation. Bryce ignored that order. He and the crew privately concluded that what they were tracking wasn't a primitive species. It was a parallel one, something that adapted, observed, and understood human presence. A being capable of thought, strategy, and retaliation. From that moment on, the expedition shifted from pursuit to survival. As Bryce put it later, "We weren't studying it anymore. It was studying us." Back at the base camp, Bryce spent hours reviewing audio data captured by parabolic microphones scattered across the forest. For days, he heard nothing but wind, distant birds, and the occasional creak of trees. Then, one night, something surfaced, faint at first, buried beneath the static. A low, resonant tone that didn't match any known animal call. It rose and fell rhythmically, almost like speech. Bryce leaned closer, adjusting the filters. The sound repeated, this time accompanied by another, lower voice, overlapping, almost conversational. He froze. "That's not random," he whispered into his recorder. "That's language." The team assembled around the monitor as Bryce replayed the file. The voices were deep, guttural, yet unnervingly articulate. They weren't growling or mimicking. They were communicating. The syllables came in patterns, 3 distinct phrases, followed by a pause, then repeated again with tonal variation. The forest itself seemed to breathe with the sound. Dr. Maria Mayer sent the sample to linguist Dr. Ronald Casper, who had previously studied suspected Bigfoot vocalization. His reply arrived within hours. "These are structured vocal patterns. They demonstrate repetition, response, and tonal shifts. Clear signs of linguistic intelligence." As they continued analyzing the recordings, something even more disturbing emerged. There weren't just 2 voices. There were multiple, some closer, some distant, weaving in and out of one another like a coordinated chant. One phrase, however, appeared consistently. A word-like sound the team later transcribed as "Kumba." The deeper voice would say it first, the others would respond, and then silence. The atmosphere in the tent turned cold. Bryce noted that the ambient noise dropped nearly to 0 during the playback. Even the surrounding microphones went dead for 8 full seconds. Maria theorized that Kumba might be a name, or perhaps a signal. Russ, however, had another theory, that it wasn't meant for them, but about them. "What if they're not warning each other?" he asked quietly. "What if they're calling us?" The crew immediately placed motion sensors around the camp perimeter. That night, just before 3 a.m., the recorders picked up a single knock on wood, followed by a faint echo of that same voice, low and deliberate. "Kumba." The crew rushed outside, lights scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. No footprints, no movement, only that echoing word fading through the trees. The next morning, Bryce radioed the network, requesting backup and authorization to retreat. The response he received was chillingly bureaucratic. Continue documentation until further notice. They were being told to stay, even as the forest began speaking back. Within days of the mysterious recordings, the Expedition Bigfoot camp changed from a scientific operation to something that looked more like a military outpost. Security tightened. Communication with the outside world was heavily restricted. Producers stopped giving daily updates to the network. Then, without warning, everything collapsed into chaos. An anonymous member of the post-production team leaked a short clip of the forest audio to a small online forum, less than 30 seconds long. In it, two distinct voices could be heard exchanging what sounded unmistakably like words. The clip ended abruptly, with a sound that resembled a deep exhale, followed by static. Within hours, the file spread like wildfire. People analyzed, slowed, and filtered it. Linguists, conspiracy theorists, and cryptozoologists all agreed on one thing. The cadence and tone were unlike any known animal. The word Kumba could clearly be heard. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the file vanished. Every copy was deleted. Forum pages were shut down, and those who had shared it received legal takedown notices. The user who first uploaded the clip deleted their account, leaving behind only one cryptic post. "We were told to stop. They said it wasn't human." That was when the network went dark. Expedition Bigfoot was pulled from every platform within 48 hours. Promotional content disappeared, websites redirected to error pages, and even the show's trailer on YouTube was removed. Crew contracts were terminated under strict non-disclosure agreements. Sources close to production said they were threatened with legal action if they ever discussed what happened in the woods. Inside the team, fear spread fast. Ronnie reportedly began having vivid nightmares, claiming he could still hear the voices whispering in the static. Maria stopped taking calls. Bryce, once the optimistic believer, went silent entirely. His final email to staff simply read, "Some things aren't meant to be recorded." Behind the scenes, there were whispers of government involvement. Unmarked vehicles were seen near the production site, and the storage facility housing the raw footage was reportedly confiscated for review. But no official agency ever confirmed their role. Whether it was corporate liability, national security, or sheer terror, the message was clear. Whatever the team had captured was never meant for public ears. By the time the dust settled, Expedition Bigfoot no longer existed. To the outside world, it was just another canceled show. But to those who were there, it was something else entirely. An operation that stumbled across the unexplainable and was shut down before the truth could escape. When the dust finally settled, Expedition Bigfoot had vanished from existence as if it had never been there. Not a single press release, no farewell post, no official statement from Discovery or Travel Channel, just silence. The show's streaming pages redirected to blank placeholders, and fans who searched for old episodes were met with error messages. To the public, it looked like an abrupt corporate decision, but to those close to the production, it looked like something far more deliberate. Crew members later admitted that they'd been ordered to surrender all footage, field notes, and personal devices used on location. Those who resisted were reminded of their contracts and threatened with lawsuits. One anonymous technician described how security personnel arrived without warning at the editing studio, collected every hard drive, and sealed them in unmarked cases. When asked what was going on, a supervisor reportedly said, "The footage is being transferred to another department." No one knew which department, or if it even belonged to the network. Bryce Johnson, the show's host, broke his silence months later during a low-profile podcast appearance. His tone was somber, his words careful. "Some discoveries change you," he said, "and some discoveries change everything." When pressed to elaborate, he refused, adding only, "We found something that looked back at us." That single line reignited the mystery. Fans flooded social media demanding the truth, but Bryce vanished again. No further interviews, no social posts, nothing. Meanwhile, Maria Mayer and Russ Accord quietly moved on to other projects, refusing to discuss the expedition. Ronnie Leblanc reportedly left the field entirely, citing psychological fatigue. Insiders claim several team members experienced insomnia, paranoia, and recurring nightmares involving deep voices calling their names from the woods. Then came the final twist. The area where the expedition took place was suddenly declared off-limits for environmental conservation. Local hikers reported new fences, motion-activated cameras, and warning signs where none had existed before. Some said they saw military-style trucks entering the region at night. Others heard strange sounds in the distance, deep, rhythmic calls echoing through the trees. Whether it was corporate damage control or a government cover-up, one thing was certain. Expedition Bigfoot hadn't just been canceled, it had been erased, and those who knew the truth weren't allowed to speak, because whatever they'd found out there was still out there.